Become a sustaining member of the Commonwealth Club for just $10 a month. Join today.
Hello, I'm George Hammond, Chair of the Humanities Forum, which organized today's event. This is one of over 700 programs at the Commonwealth Club that have been done since the pandemic began. And just wanted to, first of all, thank you all for your interest in our series of programs, and also for those of you who are watching online on YouTube or something later, we hope that you're enjoying our continuing to bring you the lectures that we brought you live in San Francisco, but now we bring it across the world through the internet. So today's program is Andrew Nagorski. His latest book is Saving Freud. He's written many books. Many of you probably know them. But today we're going to talk about this book on what happened to Sigmund Freud when he was an old man and the Anschluss in Austria happened. But we're going to go with a little bit of background first. So first of all, thank you very much for joining us, Andrew. This is a pleasure.
Thank you, George. My pleasure, too.
So my first question is, you've written on a lot of other subjects where the framework is similar, but you haven't taken on a subject like Freud in particular. So how did you run across the idea to do this book, and how long ago was it?
Well, it was, as I tell a number of people, I've written several books, but I'm always, when I finish one book and thinking about the next one, I'm always at a loss. What's going to be a topic that will, first of all, hold my interest, and then you obviously hope will hold readers' interest. And I'm never sure what that will be. And I spend a lot of time in what I call my walkabout phase, which consists of often reading a lot, whether it's diaries, letters, memoirs, and see what stories are there in a seemingly well-mined area. Of course, the early 20th century, 20s, the 30s, the rise of Hitler. That will give us some fresh take. And when this was a couple of years ago, 2.5 years ago or so, I read a memoir by Stefan Zweig, who was an Austrian Jewish writer at the beginning of the 20th century, probably the most popular writer of his time. He wrote a lot of novels, novellas, very light, entertaining, but insightful literature. And he wrote this memoir, A World of Yesterday, that is very moving. And he grew up in the same Vienna that Freud grew up in, and then he met Freud in Vienna, and he described some of his impressions of him in Vienna. And then in 1934, which is a year after Hitler has taken power in Germany, he decides to get out as an Austrian Jew. He says, this is not going to end well for any of us. And he ends up in London in 1938. And the next mention of Freud, he's meeting Freud shortly after Freud arrives in in London, after narrowly escaping the Nazis. And I thought, well, first of all, why did Freud stick around so long? Why did he almost get trapped by the Anschluss? And then he mentioned some of the friends who helped to engineer this extrication of Freud. And it got me into exploring Freud, his entourage, and to tell the story and to understand why a man who was so insightful about so much seemed to have been somewhat blindsided by events and how it would directly affect him. I went back and began to explore Freud the man, Freud the scholar, and I came to be just fascinated by him. And luckily, one thing about him, he wrote letters to everyone nonstop. There were hundreds and hundreds of letters, aside from the various memoirs and other writings. And that gives you really an insight into his mind at the time, not in retrospect. And that was, I would say, the primary resource that convinced me that not only was there a story to tell, but I'd have the materials that would allow me to tell it in a very vivid way.
Yes, and it is told very vividly. And it's interesting that you say that you see into his mind as it was at the time. I mean, he still wrote to different people differently. As you make clear in your book, he was very clever about what he was writing. So he was completely conscious of what he was writing. He wasn't unconsciously writing his part of the story.
Right.
So I think let's try to set the stage a little bit, because Freud as a younger man is different than Freud as an older man. I think one of the things that's important for everybody to understand, and your book makes it perfectly clear, at the time that he eventually left in 1938, he was 82 years old. He'd been undergoing jaw surgeries for a decade or longer that were debilitating from a physical point of view, and that he basically stayed in his house, which was also his office, for most of that time. So he wasn't moving around that much. So his wanting to stay where he was is a little bit more understandable than if he was 40 years old and on his way up.
Yes, it definitely was more understandable. And he often cited his age and that cancer of the jaw, which had developed, of course, from his famous cigar smoking, as reason why he didn't want to move. But also he had spent all his life in Vienna, except for the first 4 years as a child when they had come from what is now the Czech Republic. And he, although he would complain about Vienna a lot, he was very methodical in his lifestyle and where he even went for his daily walks, the barber who came to trim his beard, the cafes he went to, and he loved routine. And here was a man who was a very revolutionary thinker for his time, but he was a very conservative person in his personal habits. And that's also one of the intriguing things about Freud. So he really resisted the notion. He said, the idea of moving now, starting a new life elsewhere, he just didn't want to hear of it. And for that reason, to a large extent, he kept hearing this bad news, and he understood it on one level, but on another level, he didn't want to understand the implications for himself and his family.
Yeah, and at the risk of making him sound like a provincial, in Vienna, he wasn't. He had an international following. He was in touch with people in many languages. How many languages did he himself speak? Do you know? I mean, you talk a little bit about that.
His French got pretty good, although he was very self-conscious about it. His English was not bad, and he was able to write. Those were his two main languages, but he also had some Italian. He loved to go to Italy when he was younger, and he loved exploring antiquities. So, yeah, like most Central Europeans, he could navigate in at least about 3 languages.
So here he is, and he's got, at the end in the 30s, he has followers in England and America and everything, and a group of people eventually became the ones that saved him. But let's go back. That's the main part of the story. But let's go back for a little while and talk about how Freud became Freud. He was outside the mainstream almost the entire time, right?
Yeah. He was, and he was a medical student at the University of Vienna. As he himself said, he was not terribly diligent. It looked like he was just going to have an academic career, working in a laboratory. Neurology became his area, but at the same time, he wanted to somehow make a mark for himself. From his early age, he protests, for instance, to his fiancée, Martha, who later becomes his wife, that I'm not one who's looking for fame and so forth, but it's a little bit of the case of someone who protests too much, because he is looking for something very distinctive. And at first, he actually thinks it's cocaine. He experiments with cocaine. He thinks he had a friend who was desperately ill and addicted to morphine. He thought cocaine will wean him off it, until he realized this is just another addiction. And so when he realizes this is not a path that's going to lead to anything good, he also experiments with hypnosis. He goes to France and studies hypnosis, and eventually he comes across what is called the talking cure, which of course we all know as psychoanalysis. And one of the brilliant things about Freud was that that he branded it. So he came up with the term psychoanalysis and really realized this might be what helps the people who in those days were called hysterics. The terms were not politically correct,
right,
in any of this in those days. And he begins to develop this whole notion, and it starts, of course, with one of his most famous papers on the interpretation of dreams. And the whole idea of the subconscious, how it influences not only your dreams, but your behavior and so forth, was very startling and shocking to people. And he was seen as a bit of a quirky character in those days. And much of the medical establishment in Vienna sort of looked down their noses at him. But very soon that began to change. But it wasn't an easy struggle. And it's interesting also, I'll just make one other point, that the way what really propelled him to what was psychoanalysis was the need to get out of the laboratory, because he became engaged to Martha, who was from Hamburg in northern Germany. He didn't have enough money to move out of his parents' apartment. And finally his mentor at the University of Vienna said, you've got to get the skills to be able to do some work in a hospital and then start a private practice that might be a little bit more lucrative. And that's when he gets on that path that eventually a private practice becomes finally the famous Freudian couch.
Now, it's interesting when you talk about, and he's known for the cocaine interest, but the fact that it dissipated very quickly. It's a little bit like Timothy Leary, getting started with LSD and then, eventually going on to do something extremely interesting and famous. That's not what people would think of at the beginning of Freud's career. So,
yes.
Yeah.
And a little different, I'd say, career trajectory than Timothy Leary.
Yeah, quite a bit different. He must not have sampled enough of the product.
Right.
So he moves into the private practice, and as you just said, like most men, was motivated to move there by the need to create a family and to have the money for it. And so he moves out. And he starts a private practice, but he doesn't get going very quickly either. It's not an immediate success. So why don't you talk a little bit about what happened as he developed his reputation? His books obviously were a big part of that. So
his books were a big part of it. And what was a big part of it early on was this embryonic network of people who really bought into his theories. At first, it was what was called the Vienna Psychoanalytic Circle, which was a group that literally met in his quarters on Wednesday evenings, and they would be around the table, and they would talk about their writings, their patients, their theories. And Freud was of course the mover of all of that. But from a very early age, Freud had this vision that I want to move beyond Vienna and Budapest, which was the other place where many of his colleagues came from, and he was delighted when there began to be expressions of interest from elsewhere. For instance, from England, there was a Welsh doctor, a young Welsh doctor by the name of Ernest Jones, who was so enthralled by reading the early papers of Freud in German, by the way. This Jones had some German. It wasn't great. He was so excited that he actually got a German tutor to read more. In those days, Freud's works had not been translated, and he met Jones, and eventually Jones becomes his major proponent in the English-speaking world, and later the head of the International Psychoanalytical Society. And then others come to him as patients, someone like Marie Bonaparte, who had a rather famous last name. Her grandfather was the brother of Napoleon Bonaparte, and she grew up in this almost royal family, but it was not technically royalty, but one of the most famous families in Europe. And she had married into royalty. She became the princess of Greece and Denmark, since her husband was the prince of Greece and Denmark. And she came to Freud because of what a growing number of people came to Freud for was, of course, sexual problems. Because he was the one who was making sexual issues the centerpiece of his understanding of human psychology and the subconscious. And while that turned away many of the established medical profession, it attracted new followers and new patients like Marie Bonaparte, who was famous for having a string of lovers, including the Prime Minister of France, but feeling sexually frustrated and not to just put it out there. Her frustration was she couldn't achieve orgasm. She felt there's a psychological problem here. And Freud met her, and then she becomes not only his patient, but then a follower, a supporter, and a psychoanalyst in and of herself. So he's beginning to make these kinds of connections that would play a huge role in his life, and then later, of course, in his escape from Vienna.
Yeah, it's interesting because, as is often the case in these situations, he did something so significant that shifted their life that they were ready to take all kinds of risks for him when he needed help. So Ernest, let's go back to Ernest Jones for a little while, because he was a little problematic character. He wasn't particularly on the up and up too. Not that he was dishonest, but he had problems with his profession in England.
Yes, well, Ernest Jones, who was all of 5'4", and who, as one of his female colleagues said, he was irresistible to women. Well, he also seemed to be irresistible to scandals, and had numerous patients, female patients, accused him of all sorts of things, and some very young patients. And as my editor told me when I showed him my chapter on Ernest Jones, introducing Ernest Jones, he said, "Well, it's a good thing he didn't live in the Me Too age. Because he certainly would not have survived it." No. But he, a lot of these were accusations that were very much, again, the he said, she said, and with patients who were severely emotionally troubled. And so he often got the benefit of the doubt, but eventually found himself unemployable in London, and for that reason took a job in Toronto, spent some time in the States before coming back. But it's interesting also Freud's attitude on that. Freud had very early on developed this theory of transference, saying it is only natural that patients who are patients who are trying to deal with their emotional problems often transfer their affections that they feel to someone else to the therapist, to the analyst. And Freud himself, who was very, in his personal life, contrary to a lot of the people around him, was very straight-laced. He was married to Martha his entire life, 53 years, and at one point he told, I think, Marie Bonaparte, he said, I am all for this greater sexual freedom, less hypocrisy, but I have very little use for it myself. Yeah. So it's interesting that he had a different lifestyle than most of the people who naturally gravitated to him. But he believed in this theory of transference. And once, as a young doctor, he remembered a female patient sort of threw her arms around him and hugged him tightly, and he was really put off by this. And he said, it's just a risk of our trade. And he treated all these accusations against Jones the same ways. You've been suffering from transference. I understand that, and I'm not going to misjudge you because of that. Yeah, it's to transfer that idea about transference to the current time. When the Me Too first came out, it was everyone said just believe everybody, believe all women, because etc. But I'm sure Freud would have been sitting in the background and said, just wait a second. I don't think Freud would have accepted that No. And then the Johnny Depp trial probably made things shift a little bit for everybody. That maybe everything that's said is not accurate. But
like all those things, including what Freud did, you want to push the pendulum pretty far so that you can get past the status quo and get something that has been a terrible problem for a long time and push it out and say we have to look at this differently. So
yes,
the idea is a great idea, but absolutes in any idea don't work too well. Like just believe everybody, because as soon as everybody believes that you're going to believe them, then the line begins.
Yes, and Freud did not believe in those kinds of absolutes. He did not believe in political absolutes. He was he always said, "I'm not political at all. I'm just interested in psychoanalysis." But in fact, he was very scathing, for instance, about the Bolshevik Revolution and the communist ideology. A lot of young Americans who came to him as patients were sympathetic in those days. That was kind of the radical chic thing to do, to say, oh, well, those Bolsheviks, yeah, maybe they're dictatorial now, but it's only a step towards the more enlightened socialist society. And he had none of that. He said, yeah, you need freedom of expression, which socialism, communism does not give you. And you cannot have these absolutes. And he of course, he was the same way about the Nazi ideology. So, in that sense, he wanted genuine free speech, let us say, and put it in today's terms.
Right. You have a quote where one of those young Americans, having come back from the Soviet Union, is explaining that the Bolsheviks are really well-meaning, but that they have to do this. And he said, yes, they're always promising that everything will be better in the future, that we'll get the freedom in the future. He said, it just reminds me of religion, where they promise you that everything will happen in another world. He says, I want it to happen right now here.
Yes.
Don't tell me about the future.
Yeah, and you have to remember also about Freud, a good point about religion. Freud was, of course, from a Jewish family, but he was not religious at all. He always felt that he never wanted to run away from his Jewish identity and background and heritage, and he would stand up to anyone who was a visible anti-Semite. But he was not a believer, and so he did not believe in religious or political absolutes.
Yeah. All right. So one of the interesting ideas that you had, when we're talking about politics right now in your book, was as things started to move towards Nazi control of Germany, that, people foresaw that was going to be a problem pretty, early on, even before he became prime minister, that this was becoming a problem. Mussolini was already in charge in Italy, and Freud and the Austrians, or at least the Austrians part of it, were looking to Mussolini to protect them from Hitler. I think that was a very interesting thing in your book, and I think that very short window in which that was possible is usually skipped over in history about the time. So why don't you explain it? Because I think that says a lot about what Austrians. I mean, Hitler wasn't Austrian himself. Yes.
So
that's
Hitler,
also important.
Hitler was an Austrian.
Yeah.
I can't resist an aside. When I was spending a lot of time in Austria and Germany, when I was living in Germany, what was then West Germany, and there was a whole scandal about Kurt Waldheim, the UN Secretary General, and his past and his role in the Wehrmacht, the German army, and the Germans sort of had, many of my German friends would say, well, finally, Austrian history is being presented not like The Sound of Music, but and the Austrians had managed to convince the world that Hitler was a German and that Beethoven was an Austrian. Of course, it was the reverse. So the politics of this, in retrospect, it all seems very black and white. But for Austria, a small country which had been between the wars, once had been a huge empire, Austrian-Hungarian Empire, which Freud grew up in, but after World War I was what was considered pretty much a rump state. It was trying to preserve its independence, and as part of that, the Austrian leadership they had their own brand of fascism and fascist leaders, but they were trying to keep the Nazis at bay. And of course, at one point in 1934, the Nazis actually assassinated the Austrian chancellor. But his successor continues to pledge to keep Austrian independence and their own kind of politics. And Freud put a great deal of stock in this. And yes, and early on, when there was a sense that Mussolini, for various reasons, would want to protect Austrian independence, in part because in not to get too involved here in the politics, but in the South Tyrol in Italy, where there are many ethnic Germans, he did not want to have Hitler stirring them up. So he felt a buffer there might be a good thing. But that was a very short window, of course, and of course Hitler's domination of that relationship between German fascism and Italian fascism grew very quickly, and that became no longer operative. But each of these things Freud looked at and said, well, maybe this will allow Austria to survive as a state, even if it is a right-wing state, even if it is a dictatorship, but nothing on the order of Hitler's Germany. That was his initial thought.
So Mussolini, having come to power earlier, looked like he was the stronger one for quite a while to people, but that, as you said, that did not last very long. The interesting point about the buffer state, that Austria was like a buffer state between Germany and Italy, is, at least for the current times, I'm sure this is the way that Putin is thinking about the Ukraine and NATO and stuff like that. It's good to keep this history in mind at the same time. So, so we have that going on, and by that time, Freud is very famous. And when we're talking about the 30s, he's already 70 years old or so, right? Or in his 70s.
He's well into his 70s. He was born in 1856, so he turns 80 in 1936. 1936.
So, but when he was younger and he was developing his psychoanalytical group, he had mostly Jewish followers in Vienna. And then Carl Jung became interested from Switzerland, a Gentile. And they developed a relationship. And Jung was how much younger? 10, 15, 20 years, something like that?
Oh, he was he was more than 20 years younger. I think maybe 25. I don't remember the exact amount, but he was definitely one generation down.
And he became the golden child very quickly in the group.
Yes. One thing about Freud is, even at a relatively young age, he was very obsessed with this notion of how long he was going to live. He would make all these calculations about how he might die. At one point, he was saying between the age of 61 and 62, he would come up with these convoluted formulas based on some of the family history of some of his uncles and so forth. Then he'd revise it backwards. But he was clearly obsessed with that. And he was clearly obsessed with the notion that he wanted this movement to become a broader movement and that would outlive him. So for that to happen, he needed, for it to be a broader movement, he was very conscious that most of his initial circle of friends from Vienna and Budapest were Jewish. Most of the people around those first table working groups in his apartment and office were Jewish. And so he wanted Gentiles involved, because he knew, given the anti-Semitism of the time, that if this was branded as a Jewish exercise, a Jewish science, then its reach could be limited. So he was delighted when he discovered that Carl Jung, this Swiss psychiatrist, who was considered very promising and had his own institute, was interested in his writing. They started correspondence. They met. They hit it off, and immediately Freud thinks of him as the Crown Prince. He actually calls him that. And in fact, some of his Jewish colleagues are a little bit resentful, and Freud's answer to them, well, look, this is very good news for us. If I simply appointed one of you to be the successor, and he was seen as the face of the Crown Prince, then again, we will be limiting our reach. So you should be glad about that. So this very initial kind of love affair between Jung and Freud is very strong because both wanted to make it work. Jung liked the idea of expanding his reach, and Freud already was a huge authority in his field, and vice versa. Freud felt he was getting a really strong partner, but of course, without getting into a long discussion between Freud and Jung, they were two headstrong personalities. They clashed very quickly, somewhat differing theories, different about all sorts of things, and that falls apart. And so but then it's around that time he also meets Ernest Jones, who's also a Gentile.
Right.
He's a Welshman, and that too is one of the attractions for Freud. That Jones is a Gentile, and that relationship becomes a lifelong relationship, and even beyond life, because Ernest Jones becomes Freud's first major biographer after his death.
So, sounds a little bit like a personality cult, but not too strong, because there's a bunch of ideas behind it, and people usually get interested in the ideas more than the man, but the man is still central to the sets of ideas. And but let's talk now about this group of people who eventually become the major players, so that you can tell the story about how they extracted Freud from Vienna in 1938 when he really didn't quite want to go. He really didn't want to leave. So, but he's persuaded. So first, his family. So he has 4 children. He has his wife Martha, who you mentioned. There's Mina Freud, who is related. How is she related to?
She's the sister-in-law. She's Martha's sister, but had lived with them for a long time.
Okay, and then Martha and Sigmund have 4 children.
No, they actually have 6 children.
6 children. Oh, okay.
One who dies, though, who died during the Spanish flu.
So, and the one that has the most influence over the situation is Anna. So we can talk about her a little bit.
Yeah, and she's the youngest too.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Anna Freud is the one member of the family, one child who stayed with her parents, with her father, throughout all of this. The others grew up, got married, had family, and some were closer than others, but they were not part of the household. Anna stayed there, was totally dedicated to her father, and she becomes, first of all, when she's a teenager, she starts sitting in on these discussions of the psychoanalytic circle. Mm-hmm. So already at age 14, 15, she's absorbing this, and she becomes a very famous child psychologist in her own right. And later on, she begins representing her father at conferences and other events when he is no longer able to go. And she also becomes almost his primary caregiver, even though he had various doctors and he had a maid at home who helped. She was the one who really took care of his needs, where he had to have multiple operations on his jaw starting in 1923. So for 15 years, he was going through very tortuous surgeries and had a prosthesis that he had to put in. And only Anna really could manage all that and know how to take this rather cumbersome device in and out of his mouth. So she was the rock of his life. Martha was a rock in a different way, his wife, in terms of running the household, the office, and all the practical things. But in terms of being an intellectual partner and a lot of personal care, it was Anna. And so she is there. And when the Nazis come and take over, she takes charge as much as possible of dealing directly with the Nazis and shielding her father. And I should just add, one, in conjunction with Anna, she is always portrayed as this rather lonely woman. Well, when in the 1920s, a very rich American woman comes to Vienna with her 4 very troubled kids. Her name's Dorothy Burlingham. Her original name was Tiffany, and her grandfather was the founder of the Tiffany Company, Charles Tiffany, and her father was Louis Comfort Tiffany of the famous stained glass creations. And and Dorothy and Anna strike up a friendship, and then in effect they live as close to a life as a married couple as two women could in those days until the end of their lives. So and Dorothy, as an American, plays a role when all of this happened, when the Nazis come in maintaining ties with the American embassy and passing on information to the Americans about what's happening with Freud when he is threatened.
We're discussing Saving Freud, a book by Andrew Nagorski. And if you have any questions, you can send them in through the chat room to us, and we'll ask them directly of the author of this book. So when the Nazis came into Austria, within a day or two, they were in the Freud offices taking money and et cetera, et cetera. And there's some, painful but humorous stories. They came into Martin Freud's office, took the money, and unfortunately for all of them that came in stealing the money, the Nazi organization took the money away from them. So
Yes.
why don't you tell a little bit of the story of how the Freuds first dealt with it? Because even after they came and took the money, he still wasn't ready to leave.
Yes, well, remember this is 1938 when the Anschluss happens, when suddenly Hitler, the German armies cross the border with no resistance, Austria collapses, and Hitler makes a speech literally a short walk away from the Freud's apartment and offices. And these Nazi thugs, who are not yet very well organized, invade both the home and the office. And for instance, at the home, Martha Freud, Freud's wife, opens the door, sees this group of thugs, and she sort of disarms them by playing the polite hostess. She says, "Oh, won't the gentleman come in? And maybe you'd like to put your guns in the umbrella stand."
Yeah.
And yeah, they're not quite sure what to do. And by the way, there's some money on the table. Would you like to take that? Help yourselves. Mm-hmm. And then she sends Anna, the daughter, to a safe in the back room where she pulls out the equivalent of about $800, which is a huge amount of money. And why don't you take this as well? Mm-hmm. And that all, the threat is obvious, but they're trying to play it as cool as possible. Mm-hmm. And at one point, when these thugs are collecting all this money, Sigmund Freud, who's now this old man and looking very severe, he just comes out and glares at them, doesn't say a word. Mm-hmm. And these thugs sort of cower a little bit and say, "Herr Professor, Mr. Professor," mm-hmm. and say, "Oh, well, maybe we'll come back later. We will come back later." And they slink out of the room, but with their loot. Mm-hmm. And here is, again, another aspect of Freud's personality, I think, comes out in so many moments in his biography, which I try to show in the book. The family sits down, and everyone is very shaken, and Anna is particularly shaken. In fact, she asks her parents, and especially her father, "Shouldn't we all just commit suicide? Should we just kill ourselves?" Mm-hmm. And Freud's answer is no. Why? Because they want us to? Mm-hmm. In other words, he was always going to stand up, even though he had miscalculated and should have gotten out a lot earlier. Mm-hmm. And also, he asked, well, how much money did they take when he heard how much money they took? And his answer was, "I never took so much for a single visit." He just, even in the most dire circumstances, his sort of dry sense of humor would kick in. But of course, this was no joke. There was then, in those days, this is before the Holocaust, the anti-Semitic policies are clear, but what exactly is going to happen to rich Jewish families like the Freuds, and especially prominent ones, is unclear. Are they going to be looted and killed? Are they going to be looted and then kicked out, imprisoned? Who knew? So they had to navigate this uncertain terrain. And that's that whole history where, first of all, as you say, Freud was still a little reluctant. Thought his son Martin said he thought maybe this will pass, maybe this is just a passing phase. But he was kidding. He knew he was deluding himself. Mm-hmm. And then when the moment that really changed his mind was when Anna gets summoned by the Gestapo. Mm-hmm. And a couple of Gestapo cars come, pick her up, to drive her off, and she's gone for hours. They don't know, is she coming back? What's happening over there? Finally, she comes back in the evening, and Freud is visibly shaken. And at that point, he is desperate to get out. And he says basically to Jones and others, look, Martha and I are old. We might stick it out. We don't have much time left. But Anna has a lot of years ahead of her. She should have a lot of years ahead of her. I'm not going to deprive her of that. And I know she'll never leave without me. So therefore, let's do everything to get out. And that's when everybody converges. Ernest Jones flies in from London. Marie Bonaparte comes in from Paris. William Bullitt, who's another character, the U.S. ambassador to France, who had collaborated with Freud on a book about Woodrow Wilson, whom they both despised, by the way, and had his diplomats in Vienna monitoring the situation, actually parking an embassy car in front of the Freud building with an American flag on it up front, because in those days you still had the sense that Hitler didn't want to antagonize the whole world, especially the Americans, so quickly. So they tried to play on that. So all of these people kicked into action. His personal doctor, Max Schur, who was a younger Jewish physician from Vienna, was taking care of Freud medically, but also psychologically in some ways. So you had this.
You should tell the detail about Max Schur. This young doctor, he was sure that there was going to be a huge problem, and he got visas for his whole family to leave as early as 1937, but he wouldn't leave until Freud left. That's some dedication to Freud.
Yes. And yeah, he had a young family, had 2 young children. And by the way, his son, Peter Schur, who's a doctor, I discovered was living in Boston. It is living in Boston. He's on the board. He's still practicing and on the board and at Harvard Medical School. He's now close to 90. Yeah. But he has memories as a child of that year and how they got out. But yes, Max Schur, his father, could have left with his family. And he said, no, I'm going. He knew that also Freud would not live that long. He said, I'm not going to leave Freud. And also one thing about Max Schur, when Freud took him on as his personal physician, he asked him, he said, I know I have cancer of the jaw. When it becomes unbearable, you have to promise that you'll help me end it. And Schur delivered that promise and then made sure he carried out that promise when that moment came later in London. So I think the other thing all of this shows is the incredible attachment people felt towards Freud, not only admiration for him, but genuine affection, incredibly strong ties. He was a difficult person. Many people called him prickly and arrogant, but the people who he developed the closest relationships with, it was a mutual affection.
Yeah, that's a very interesting part of your book, is that his sense of humor, for example, as you mentioned, at times of stress, was very crucial for everybody around him, and that he didn't fall apart himself. And it reminded me a little bit of Ronald Reagan, because lots of people didn't like him for his policies, but when he got shot and he made jokes about it, then he suddenly his popularity exceeded his ideas. His ideas were irrelevant at that point, and I'm sure that Freud must have got a little bit of that, because a lot of people thought, well, that's one explanation, but that's a little bit too far out. I mean, I'm sure that was when he first started talking about his ideas.
Yes, well, he was endearing. I mean, his ideas obviously were very strong, very controversial, but just on a human level, his ability to use humor in a variety of ways, sometimes self-deprecating humor too, was very endearing.
Yeah. So this group goes into action. He makes his mind up. I'm going to leave because my daughter, needs to leave, and she won't leave without me. So we're going to get out of here. It's really quite a story. We don't have to go into all the details because they're in the book, to be read. But as you said, the American embassy got involved. This William Bullitt that you mentioned had someone that used to work for him in the Soviet Union when he was the ambassador there, who is now in Vienna, John Wiley, and he would go over personally as a result of his boss telling him to, I'm sure, and sit outside or go inside and be a barrier to the Nazis. But then they had to talk the Nazi overseer of you said in your book that the Nazis appointed trustees of all the Jewish wealth, basically, or all the Jewish families. And so this one guy was appointed, Anton Sauerwald, yeah, something like that.
Yes. Yeah.
And he, what an interesting character he turned out to be.
Yes, he's the most surprising character, I think.
Yeah. So
yes,
he takes over and he's mean. He starts off really mean, and he doesn't stay that way.
Yes, I mean, Sauerwald, he comes in as a 35-year-old Nazi bureaucrat, really nasty, spewing anti-Semitic remarks. But after a while, he's sitting in the Freud apartment a lot of time, going over all sorts of their supposed assets, finances. But he's also picking up Freud's writings. Mm-hmm. He's clearly impressed by them. And Sauerwald was a graduate of the University of Vienna. He studied chemistry. And it turned out he had studied chemistry with an older Jewish professor who had died since, but who had been a friend of Freud. Mm-hmm. And in some ways, it appeared that Sauerwald identified Freud with his former Jewish professor, which made him see him as the exception to, let us say, his anti-Semitic beliefs, and at a certain point, these overseers, these trustees as they were called, had a great deal of discretion because, as I mentioned in the beginning, the rules were not yet set. Mm-hmm. In terms of, it wasn't a question of just how much money would be extorted, but then what would happen. And Freud was vulnerable on a level because he had a number of foreign patients. He had managed to build up quite a clientele of patients from the United States in particular, and from Britain in particular, who were able to also pay in hard currency, which was highly valued. Mm-hmm. And because of that, he had foreign bank accounts, which had been perfectly legal until the Anschluss, but instantly illegal after the Anschluss. Mm-hmm. And of course, Freud did not talk about it, or Anna didn't. But Sauerwald, as he was sort of examining all the books and talking to people, realized that. And if he had told his higher ups about this, that might have been enough to just for them to veto his departure and say, mm-hmm. he just deserves to be incarcerated, or at least held here, or not given a visa. Mm-hmm. And he stayed quiet until the Freuds were allowed to leave, mm-hmm. which is a remarkable sin of omission, or let us say an act of grace by omission. And Anna Freud later on said that was a key moment, that without that, they may not have gotten out. And one thing that's worth pointing out is people say, well, Freud was so well known, he would not have died in the Holocaust. Well, 4 of his sisters who stayed behind all died in the Holocaust.
Yeah. And there are plenty of famous people that died in the Holocaust. It's not they might have made an example of him rather than, an exception of him. It could
have worked either way.
Yeah. So there's an interesting little epilogue to that Anton Sauerwald story, which was after the war when he was being prosecuted for what he did as a Nazi, that one of the Freud grandchildren or whatever.
It was a nephew, I think.
A nephew who wanted to attack him and have him done. But Anna Freud stepped in and said, no, whatever else he did, he helped us. Yes.
It was Henry Freud who was a nephew, I think, who had later on served in the American Army. Mm-hmm. Believed he wanted to basically testify for the prosecution. Mm-hmm. And Anna Freud wrote a letter to Sauerwald's wife, and that she used to help defend her husband and eventually get him freed.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Interesting bedfellows, as they say, the situation is made. So So their trustee looked like it was going to be a terror, ended up liking them enough to look the other way and let them go. And they got these visas, but they weren't happy until they crossed the French border. I mean, they never felt it could change at any moment. But it was not just him. How many people went? It was quite a big group.
Yes, it was. I mean, they didn't all go at once, but Ernest Jones, by the way, again, he not only helped convince Freud to leave, but he made it his mission to go back to Britain and get entry permits for every member of the Freud family who was still in Austria who wanted to go, and then for Max Schur and his kids, and his wife and kids, and for one or two for a housekeeper and a couple of other friends, close relatives, which meant it was a party that eventually, I think in the end, he got something like 24 entry permits to Britain.
Mm-hmm.
Now, in those days, 1938, Britain and almost every other country in Western Europe, including the U.S., by the way, was not eager for Jewish refugees from the Third Reich,
right,
to put it mildly. Jones used every connection in the book to pull it off. And that's another reason I think that his other proclivities, I think he proved himself to be an incredibly loyal friend and very instrumental in saving Freud and this whole party of people.
Yeah, how he got the British passes, to come in was also interesting. He went to a friend who knew the prime minister, something like that, right? It was a whole
series of relationships of people in the Royal Society of Medicine, people he knew in the government through his ice skating club. It was a very British story too.
Yeah, very British
clubs,
story.
The right connections.
It's not what you know, it's who you know. That was a perfect example of that.
Oh yes, yes, and then how you exploit that.
And how you exploit it. I thought another great part of the story was Marie Bonaparte, being the Princess of Greece and Denmark, wearing her kind of making it clear that she's a princess, and she would sit on the staircase in Freud's house so that whenever the Nazis came in, they really wouldn't push past her because she was.
Yeah, well, they had to go past her, but they felt very intimidated, and the whole idea was just like the American embassy car down below in the courtyard with the flag there, and say, "We're all watching."
Yeah,
the diplomatic community is watching. This man is too important to just disappear in this newly occupied country. So, and Marie Bonaparte was very instrumental in that, and she was instrumental in so many other things. She would go in and she would literally grab various documents and some of his art. Freud loved to collect all sorts of small sculptures and statues from Greek, Roman, Etruscan, and she would each time under her skirt would carry out some of this stuff and then deposit it in the Greek embassy, and then it would go out by diplomatic pouch. So as a result, when you go see the Freud Museum in Vienna these days, which is his old apartment and office, is very sparsely there's very sparsely decorated. There are very few of his original belongings. It's interesting, but most of that stuff eventually shows up in London. And you go to the Freud house in London, where he lived the last 15 months of his life, and it has his original couch. It's got almost all a huge amount of his sculptures and artwork. It's a mass. So and that, to a large extent, was Marie Bonaparte. She also put up the most money to pay the bribes for the Nazis.
Right. I was going to say that her money got involved. And eventually he wanted to pay her back. I mean, what was the, yeah.
Yes, he insisted when he was in a position to do so to pay back as much as he could.
Yeah. Yeah, and Dorothy, Anna's friend, who was Freud's student and so on, or client, she also used her money to help things move along.
Dorothy Burlingham Tiffany was also, did whatever she could to help not only Anna Freud, who became her partner, but the whole family. And for instance, Freud's sister-in-law had gotten very ill, and she actually escorted her out to Switzerland earlier before the rest of the party.
Yeah. this small circle. I mean, eventually Ernest Jones, who was the doctor from the Welsh doctor,
Yes.
he eventually became extremely important in the psychoanalytic community. Was that while Freud was still alive, or after he had passed?
Oh no, while he was still alive,
Mm-hmm.
for instance, and he in effect became the successor to to our Swiss doctor who had fallen out of sorts with Carl Jung with Freud, and Carl Jung had become at first was the first president of when they formed this International Psychoanalytic Society.
Mm-hmm.
And then they had annual conventions. And then Jones repeatedly took on that role. So he was he founded the British Psychoanalytic Society, but he was a moving force of the international movement. And he also set up a whole press operation in Britain to publish Freud's works, which incidentally was tied to Leonard Woolf, the husband of Virginia Woolf.
Right.
The famous. One of the other interesting things is that everybody wanted to meet Freud. Everyone wanted. So you have Virginia Woolf, H.G. Wells, Salvador Dali. They all sort of pop in and out of the picture, and it's amazing. Mm-hmm. Through Freud in a circle, you get a whole window on the cultural and intellectual life of that period.
Yeah, you'd wonder nowadays, I mean, people put their own information about what's going on in their psyche on the internet themselves. But I'm sure that some of these famous people were not, thinking ahead and saying, this guy's going to be so famous that everyone's going to find out what we what we said to them. I mean, there's this story about Ernst Jones doing psychoanalysis for D.H. Lawrence and his wife. Which,
yes.
Which is,
that's right.
Early
that's another
on,
one. That he was fascinated by D.H. Lawrence and his wife, but I think eventually he said, "Oh my God, this is too much for any psychoanalyst to deal with."
It created quite a few interesting novels, but it wasn't fun to live, apparently.
Yes. For the creative process, it was good, but for normal human interaction, it proved unbearable.
Unbearable, yes. So we have one comment from one of our listeners, Dr. Nancy. I can't get to it right now, but I know what it is. Basically, she said she's not a fan of Freud. She prefers Carl Jung. So in this story, that was part of it. But why don't we talk just a little bit for how they split, because they did split a little bit personality clash, but also ideas. Freud wanted him to say, no, the way I look at this is better than the way you look at it. That didn't go over. So which ideas did they kind of split on a basic thing?
Well, I think there were a number of things. As you say, it's personality, leadership, and Freud was pretty absolute that the people in his movement, he wanted them to accept the basic principles. And the basic principle, this is vastly oversimplifying, but Freud's emphasis on sexuality as the driving force of so much of human behavior. And Jung felt he was overdoing that. And right in the beginning, even when they were in kind of their honeymoon phase, Jung would say, well, I reserve, I'm in awe of your ideas and your theories, but I would reserve some judgment on that issue. So that was one of them. Also, Freud believed that Jung was a little too mystical for him at times, that his interest in what were called in those days primitive cultures sort of veered into kind of mystery and fantasy. So there were these ideas. I'm not doing justice to them at all, but they were that departure. But I would say at the core of it, always with Freud, and some of his early breaks with some of his mentors were on the same subject, was basically how much emphasis do you put on how sexuality from a very early age defines our personalities and the people we become.
it's interesting because they're both, I mean, and the same thing has been said about Jung now too. I mean, there's too much emphasis on symbolism or mysticism, just like Freud said. And,
Yes.
and what Jung said about Freud, also people think today, is too much emphasis on sexuality. So they both had relatively good criticisms of each other.
Yes.
Because at least posterity has made the same judgments about both of them, but both still extremely influential in helping us try to understand what is going on inside of our minds when we're
Yeah,
sleeping,
and
among other things, you know.
Right. And I would say, yeah, I've talked to many psychiatrists who say, well, Freud's ideas are out of date. I don't really follow them. Well, I would say, yes, there are different theories, different iterations, but everybody takes, whether consciously or subconsciously to use his terms, takes Freud's ideas as a starting point.
Yeah.
And a lot of his ideas, which now we all internalize, the notion that dreams can mean something, that our subconscious works in ways that is not necessarily rational, but does express a lot of the impulses that are within us. Those things, I think, really defined him and continue to have a huge influence, even if sort of, let's say, the theoretical construct around whatever theories that are evolved, the next iterations of those theories that evolve have changed. I think the impact of Freud was tremendous, and Jung too, but I would say Freud more so. And maybe I'm just partial because I wrote a book about Freud.
Projecting.
Right.
No, at this time I always like to mention about Newton. I mean, Newton, obviously his ideas in physics have been extremely influential, but he also had a whole bunch of ideas about the numerology of the Bible and a bunch of other things that everybody has ignored, ever since, and he spent more time on them than he spent on the physics. So
yes, and just by the way, mentioning Newton,
yeah,
one of Freud's real satisfactions when he came to London, to his surprise. I mean, he'd always been an Anglophile of sorts. He'd only visited once as a young man, but he really liked England, as opposed to the United States, by the way. But that's a whole different story. But yeah, he was an Anglophile. But one of his proudest moments when he came to England, and he was treated as a celebrity. Everybody was coming to see him, honoring him. But the biggest honor was when the Royal Society elected him, asked him to sign their charter book, and he signs this book, and he signs it very close to the signatures of Charles Darwin and Isaac Newton.
Yeah.
And you can say, all right, both men, you can say agree or disagree with parts of their theories, but to be in that league felt pretty good.
Yeah, and I think regardless of what people think about all of his overall theories, he's still in that league, considered in that league of people whose thoughts have influenced us. And if you just think about some of the basic ideas, as you said, the unconscious has an influence that we don't pay attention to, and that even the development of ideas like projection, as I mentioned a little earlier. I mean, projection is such a big idea about how we express ourselves in life, and explains things that people didn't think about before. So that's just, all he'd have to do is that one idea, and he would, that would be enough on the unconscious. So thank you very much for both writing the book and for joining us at the Commonwealth Club. We really appreciate your insights, and the book itself is a great read. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, George. It's been a pleasure.
It has. And so ends another event at the Commonwealth Club in our 120th year of enlightened discussion. We hope to see you at the club soon. We're now open for in-person programs quite often. Thanks again, Andrew. That was really a good discussion.
Thank you.